Check, check. Welcome, everyone, to the first forum of the fall 2025 semester. I'm John. I help coordinate the forum, along with the help of a bunch of other people. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Chris to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, everyone, for being here for our first Geospatial Forum of the year and semester. So excited to introduce Dr. Matt Dannenberg. He did his PhD and master's at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the geography department, which is where we met and became good friends and colleagues. And now he's an associate professor at the University of Iowa, and he will be talking about his work using remote sensing to monitor dryland ecosystems. So with that, I'll hand off to Matt and
All right. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, like Chris said, I did my PhD and my master's just down the road here. I also overlapped with Josh Gray there by 1 year. Josh and I were in the same lab. Chris and I hung out all the time and were like conference roommates occasionally. So yeah, good. I've got a long North Carolina connection here, and so it's good to be back. Sorry that I couldn't make it last spring when I was supposed to. We got snowed out, unfortunately, but I'm here now. So today I'm going to talk about a very different type of environment than North Carolina. I'm going to talk about dryland ecosystems, and specifically I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that we encounter with monitoring drylands with remote sensing, and some of the ways that we're trying to deal with those problems. So I'm first going to just acknowledge all my co-authors and collaborators on this. This has been work that's been going on for a pretty long time, especially with University of Arizona, folks at Indiana University, and folks at USDA. And so obviously couldn't do it without them. And then this is all funded by NASA's Soil Moisture Active Passive program. And so I'll talk about SMAP a fair bit today as well. So broadly speaking, just to kind of introduce the sort of work I do, I'm a global change ecologist. And in global change ecology, what we try to answer is the question, how do ecological systems respond to and interact with anthropogenic change? And of course, there's a lot of ways that anthropogenic activity is changing the Earth system, conceptualized over here in this figure, which is from a paper that was trying to think through how far we've pushed the Earth system beyond what it can reasonably sustain. And they break it down into a few different categories of ways that we've changed the Earth system, things like alterations to biodiversity, alterations to land use and water use. The one that I mostly focus on is climate change and how climate change influences Earth's ecosystems, and in turn, how Earth's ecosystems feed back into affecting further climate change. And so that's the big question that drives most of my research. How does intensification of the water cycle, especially from climate change, affect Earth's ecosystems? Especially, how does it affect carbon uptake by Earth's ecosystems and water use by Earth's ecosystems? In order to answer that question, we need geospatial data. And what I'm going to talk about today is largely some of the challenges that we encounter with using geospatial data to answer this question, especially when we're trying to answer this question in drylands, which turn out to be a fairly challenging type of system in some respects for remote sensing to deal with. Before we get into that, though, I want to give a very quick overview of the ecosystem carbon budget, since I'm going to talk about some of these terms over the course of this talk. So everything basically starts with photosynthesis. And at the ecosystem level, we call that gross primary production. If you were to sum up all of the carbohydrates produced by every leaf in a given ecosystem, you would get something called gross primary production, or GPP. Globally, if you were to sum up all of the gross primary production for the entire Earth, it's roughly 120 petagrams of carbon that enters ecosystems from the atmosphere every single year. For a little context, 1 petagram is roughly the mass of 1 billion adult elephants. So there are 120 billion adult elephants worth of carbon going from the atmosphere into ecosystems every single year. At the same time, some of that carbon gets used by plants to perform their basic metabolic functions and to keep themselves alive. And it gets returned to the atmosphere through what we call autotrophic respiration, Autotrophic, meaning that it's basically self-feeding. It's the plant feeding on its own carbohydrates. And that returns about half of that carbon to the atmosphere. While plants are photosynthesizing, they're also losing water through evapotranspiration. And I'll talk a fair bit about that today as well. And then when those plants die, they decompose and return the other half of that gross primary production back to the atmosphere through heterotrophic respiration. Heterotrophic just basically means feeding by other organisms. So it's largely decomposition of organic matter by microbes in the soil. If you were to calculate the balance between gross primary production on the one hand and then these two respiratory terms on the other, the leftover is what we call net ecosystem production. And that's basically the carbon sink that ecosystems provide. And it averages roughly 2 to 3 petagrams per year of net carbon uptake by the land surface. So mostly what I'm going to focus on today are these two, gross primary production and evapotranspiration, and specifically how we can estimate them at global scales using remote sensing. The way that we measure them on the ground, though, is usually using something called an eddy covariance flux tower, shown right here. This is not a flux tower. This is something different that I'll actually talk about a little bit later. But basically, the way that eddy covariance works is as wind moves over the land surface, the surface exerts friction on that wind, which causes the wind to not just have a horizontal dimension, but also a vertical dimension. And so as that wind is passing over the surface, it's tumbling and forming these disorganized eddies. And those eddies move gases between the surface and the surrounding atmosphere. And so basically the way that eddy covariance works is by looking at the concentrations of those gases when the wind is pointed down versus when the wind is pointed up. If, for example, the CO2 concentration is greater in the air when the wind is pointed down than when it's pointed up, that means that the system removed some of that CO2 through photosynthesis. And that's the gist for how we measure something like gross primary production. We do the same with water vapor, which tells us evapotranspiration by the surface. And that's basically how these work. The challenge is there's not that many of these across the globe. There's several hundred, but these measure photosynthesis and evapotranspiration at very specific points. And what we want to know, if we want to address the question, how is climate change affecting Earth's ecosystems, we need to know how is it affecting every point, not just the points where we're actually measuring this. And so what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is how can we use remote sensing to basically upscale those point measurements to estimate and monitor carbon and water cycling at a global scale, specifically for drylands where we have even fewer observations of those fluxes than we do in other types of ecosystems. So this is the main question that I'm going to address today. So I'm going to talk about a couple things. I'm first going to answer the question, why do we care about drylands in the first place? And more specifically, why do I care about drylands, which is a slightly different answer than why you should care about drylands, perhaps. I'm going to talk about why drylands are challenging from a remote sensing perspective, what it is about them that's unique compared to more humid systems. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about what we're doing to try to overcome some of those challenges and to be able to improve our estimates of remotely sensed carbon and water fluxes. So let's start with why we should care about drylands and why I care about drylands. Often when we picture drylands, we might picture something like the Sahara Desert, a wasteland of sand and rock with very little vegetation. In reality, a lot of drylands don't look like that. They're actually very diverse. They have very green surfaces and complex canopies, and they're actually like super interesting and beautiful. And that's part of the reason why I care about drylands, to answer that question, is I think these are some of the most beautiful landscapes on Earth. I lived in Tucson for a couple years and fell in love with them. Part of the reason I'm an environmental scientist in the first place is because of what ended up being a fairly transformative trip in my life, which was a backpacking trip I did in the Colorado Rockies back when I was like 18 years old. That was really my first experience of wilderness of any kind. And that's kind of what I think led to me being interested in the kinds of things that I'm interested in now. So that's a big part of the reason why I care about drylands, is just because I think they're beautiful and special landscapes. On a more like objective level and less personal, they're also our largest biome on Earth. 40% of Earth's land surface is some flavor of dryland. And that ranges from like the hyper-arid systems in the Sahara to more like the semi-arid systems that I showed that image of from Tucson. But 40% of Earth's land surface is covered by drylands. Something like 2 to 3 billion people live in drylands. A lot of our crop production and grazing land is in drylands. So there's a lot of reasons that drylands are really important to humanity. They also have very high biodiversity, and especially very high endemic biodiversity. There's a lot of plants and animals that occur in drylands and nowhere else. If we look at these two maps, the top one is showing vascular plant diversity. The bottom one is showing reptilian diversity. And we can see that in places like the Western US, we have higher endemic biodiversity than anywhere else in North America. In places like Australia, we have extremely high endemic biodiversity. So a lot of species occur in drylands and nowhere else. Further, a lot of those species are threatened in various ways. This is the Sierra Nevada red fox, which is a threatened species. It's emblematic of a lot of the species that are characteristic of drylands. A lot of them are threatened due to land use change and climate change. And further, a lot of those threatened species have inadequate coverage of their home ranges in protected areas. And so this figure is basically showing for different types of species, amphibians, birds, mammals, and reptiles, how many species are in like these different range protection categories. And the overall message is that most dryland vertebrates, including many of the endemic ones, have inadequate range coverage to protect them from the threats that they're facing. So that's another reason why we care about drylands. From a climate perspective, we also care about drylands because they're really important in the terrestrial carbon cycle. So here I'm showing, just back to the pre-industrial age, our emissions of carbon dioxide from fossil fuels and land use change, and where those emissions go. And there's basically three places that those emissions can go. They can go to terrestrial ecosystems through net ecosystem production, they can stay in the atmosphere, or they can go into the oceans through biological production in the oceans. About 50% of the CO2 that we emit stays in the atmosphere. The other 50% goes either into oceanic ecosystems or terrestrial ecosystems. And so those ecosystem processes are effectively giving us a 50% off discount on our carbon emissions by sequestering that CO2. Drylands play a surprisingly big role in that carbon sink. By their very nature, drylands don't have a whole lot of vegetation, but the vegetation that they do have is extremely sensitive to changes in our climate and extremely sensitive to changes in land use. And so if we look at changes in our terrestrial carbon sink back through time, about 60% of the trends in the terrestrial carbon sink are attributable specifically to changes in dryland ecosystems. About 40% of the interannual variability of the carbon sink on land is attributable specifically to drylands. So drylands play an extremely important role in governing our carbon cycle and governing the trends in that carbon cycle. So those are some of the reasons why I think drylands are particularly interesting and important. But here's the problem. Remote sensing doesn't do a great job currently at estimating especially the variability of carbon and water fluxes in drylands. This is from a paper published by one of my collaborators back in 2017, examining how well one particular satellite-based model was doing at capturing variation in gross primary production on the top and evapotranspiration on the bottom. And essentially what they found is that only about 30% of the interannual variability was actually captured by these satellite-based models. This is showing for only a single model, but this is fairly emblematic of a broader scale problem than just that single model. The extremes in both the carbon and water cycle are dramatically underestimated by satellite-based estimates. And in some of the work that I've done, we've seen that not only are the extremes underestimated, but in some cases, the models do a really bad job of getting any of the dynamics right. So this is at 4 flux sites in the Western US. What I'm showing is evapotranspiration and just the seasonal means. The black is basically the measured evapotranspiration from our flux towers. and the gray is showing one of the satellite-based evapotranspiration models. And what we can see is that in some cases, the seasonality of evapotranspiration is shifted either earlier or later. In some cases, that seasonality is underestimated pretty dramatically, and the magnitude of evapotranspiration is underestimated pretty dramatically. Sometimes we actually get the exact opposite seasonality from the satellites than what the ground-based sensors measure. And sometimes they show almost no seasonality whatsoever in the evapotranspiration. So it's a widespread problem that satellite-based models just don't do a particularly good job to date at being able to capture how variable dryland carbon and water fluxes are. And what that means is that we're underestimating the effects of extreme events on drylands as well. This is from a paper that I published a few years ago, looking specifically at what at the time was the most extreme drought that the Southwest had experienced over the past 120 plus years. During the summer of 2020, there was basically no monsoon rainfall in this region that's very dependent on monsoon rainfall. And what we were looking at is what that meant for the carbon uptake of these systems. And essentially what we found is, first of all, that obviously when you have a drought in a dry system, you get reductions in productivity. But what we also found is that the satellite-based estimates underestimated that sensitivity to drought by about 40%. So in this figure, for example, we're showing in kind of these greenish bars, the true measured from the flux tower response of gross primary production to that drought. And in the more yellow bars, what the satellites thought the response to drought was. And so it underestimates the drought effect by about 40% on average. So overall, the satellite-based products are not capturing the variability of gross primary production and evapotranspiration, and they're underestimating the effects of extreme events. And so that brings us to the next question, which is why? Why are drylands so challenging from a remotely sensed perspective? And so that's what I'm going to talk about next, and then we'll talk about kind of what we're doing to solve that problem. So a few years ago, me and Bill Smith at University of Arizona led a paper trying to conceptualize what we're doing well with dryland remote sensing and what we're doing poorly and what we could do to solve the problem. And so I'm going to go through some of the challenges that we identified in that paper. And then what we've been working on a lot since then is trying to actually implement the solutions that we suggested might help. So the first challenge is that a lot of satellite-based evapotranspiration and productivity estimates are based on greenness to some extent. They use vegetation indices to either directly estimate the productivity or evapotranspiration, or they use it as like an input to say roughly what the state of the system is. The problem in drylands is that greenness does not tell the whole story with dryland ecosystem function. Here, for example, this is an image from a flux tower in just south of Tucson. This is the Santa Rita Mesquite Tower. And this is a very dry time of year. You can see all the grasses are brown, right? The shrubs, though, are still green. They're not photosynthesizing very much or transpiring very much, but they're still green. Because a lot of the woody plants in dry systems have adaptations to drought where they stay green during those extremely dry periods. And so from a greenness perspective, for the shrubs, it doesn't really look like much changed, even though they're not actively photosynthesizing. And what we found is that the relationship between gross primary production and one example of a greenness index, NDVI, that relationship is pretty weak, especially in a lot of shrubby systems where the plants are adapted to that drought and stay green during those dry periods. The other problem is that, as you can see in this image, there's a lot of soil mixed into the remotely sensed signal, especially in the more open canopies. And we did some just simple simulations with a radiative transfer model to see how that exposed soil affects the vegetation index. And so here we have two different figures, one showing for a very sparse open canopy, one for a very dense canopy, how different types of soils impact the vegetation spectral signature. In a dense canopy, where you have lots of leaves and very little exposed soil, the soil characteristics don't really matter that much. it doesn't really affect the spectral signature that much. For drylands, where we have very sparse canopies, the spectral signature looks wildly different depending on how dark or how wet the soil is. And so that contaminates that greenness signal that we get and erodes some of the predictability that we can get with greenness indices. The second challenge that we encounter is that drylands are extremely coupled to soil moisture. That's the single most important driver of evapotranspiration and production in dryland systems. So I'm going to break down this figure a little bit. This is from a paper we published a couple years ago. And no, this is not a typo. There's another person named Dannenberg who I work with. So our goal is to eventually produce a paper that has nothing but Annenbergs of some flavor in the author list. There's a few others actually that also have Annenberg names. We're working on it, but we're not there yet. So what we're showing here is the correlation between GPP, gross primary production in green, evapotranspiration in blue, and a few different driver variables that are commonly used in remotely sensed models. The ones that are most often used in these models are air temperature, vapor pressure deficit, and PPFD, which is basically the sunlight that plants are able to use. That makes sense. You can't get photosynthesis without light. Generally speaking, these models assume that below some minimum temperature, plants aren't going to be active, and as that temperature increases up to an optimal level, photosynthesis will increase along with it. And then vapor pressure deficit is basically the dryness of the atmosphere, which is used in a lot of cases as a proxy for moisture stress. Basically, what we see in drylands is very different than what we see in more humid systems. We see essentially no relationship or even a negative relationship between air temperature and production. We see basically no impact of variation in light because in drylands, light is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for photosynthesis. There's plenty of light usually. So that's not a limiting factor. To some extent, we see negative correlations with the dryness of the atmosphere, but a lot weaker than we see in other types of ecosystems. And that dryness alone of the atmosphere does not capture as much variation in evapotranspiration or gross primary production as soil moisture does. The problem is that soil moisture is not explicitly included in a lot of satellite-based models because it's hard to measure largely. These things are easy to measure. This is pretty hard to measure. But despite it being hard to measure, it's extremely important for understanding the ecosystem dynamics. So our second issue that we identified was that a lot of models aren't including the single thing that's most important for driving ecosystem processes in drylands. The third problem that we identified is that drylands are particularly unique. And what we mean by unique is that it's harder to extrapolate a relationship fit at a different site to a site that was unseen by the model than it is in other types of ecosystems. So what's shown here is a really nice paper from Houghton in 2018 showing basically a uniqueness score as a function of precipitation. In other words, how hard is it to predict, in this case, net ecosystem exchange, which is the reverse of net ecosystem production. How hard is it to predict that at a site that was unseen by the model? And basically, where we see the highest uniqueness is in the drier systems and relatively low uniqueness in more humid systems, which means it's harder to predict or extrapolate models fit in one place to other places. In other words, to paraphrase Tolstoy, all humid sites are alike. All dryland sites are unhappy in their own way. And so this is a problem because of the sparse representation of drylands in the flux tower networks. So I mentioned that we've got a few hundred flux towers across the globe. This map is basically showing where those are located. Relatively few of them are in drylands. This is showing the proportion of this FluxNet network that is within a dryland system. And up until recently, drylands were wildly underrepresented in this flux tower database. Mostly the towers are located in extratropical forests and in croplands. And there are relatively few in arid and semi-arid sites. And so if you have high uniqueness of dryland ecosystems combined with relatively few observations, that proves to be a problem for the models. because those satellite-based models are built using this network largely. And then the fourth thing that we identified as a problem is just the variance structure of primary production and evapotranspiration. And I'll kind of talk through what I mean here. So what I'm showing here is basically the standard deviation of gross primary production through space versus seasonally at an individual site versus interannually. So in other words, how much variation is there from one site to another in their average primary production? How much variation is there between winter and summer? And how much variation is there from year to year? The least amount of variation occurs from year to year. Most of the variance is spatial, then seasonal, and then interannual. And so a big part of the reason why the models largely underestimate the interannual variability is probably because that's where the least amount of variance is. And so if you're an empirical model that's trying to minimize some cost function, it makes sense to fit first to the place where most of the variance is and to kind of discount where there's the least variance. But this is precisely what we're interested in. That's the problem. So the model's fitting to something that we're not super interested in, the spatial variation, and not to the thing that we are interested in, which is the interannual variability. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we deal with some of these problems in the approaches that we're doing. And so that's what we'll get to now. We'll talk a little bit about what are we doing to actually improve on our ability to monitor carbon and water fluxes with remote sensing. So I'm going to talk very briefly about how we remotely sense ecosystem function and how remote sensing relates to the things that we're trying to estimate. So this is a very close-up image of a cross-section of a leaf. We've got our epidermis, the outer layer, and then we've got all of the mesophyll cells in the middle, each of which have these chloroplasts. So I'm just going to very quickly talk about how leaves interact with radiation, which is the basis for us being able to remotely sense photosynthesis and transpiration in the first place. So we have sunlight, incoming solar radiation coming in. A few things can happen with that. Some of it gets reflected, some of it gets absorbed, and some of it gets transmitted through the leaf. Of the proportion that gets absorbed, three things can happen. It can get used for photosynthesis, it can get used to heat the leaf, some of which results in that excess heat getting quenched non-photochemically, as we say. Basically, it's the leaf trying to shed heat. And some of it gets fluoresced by the chlorophyll itself. Fluorescence is basically chlorophyll glowing in the dark. When it absorbs radiation, some of that radiation gets re-radiated back out from that chlorophyll fluorescence. It's a very small proportion of the overall radiation budget. It's something like 1 to 5% of the absorbed light goes to fluorescence. What we care about is the photosynthesis. Now, the leaves are also getting radiation from our atmosphere. They're getting thermal radiation that's coming in. That doesn't get used for photosynthesis, but it does heat up the leaves. And when the leaves heat up, they emit radiation, thermal radiation, back out towards space. Leaves also shed heat through two mechanisms, latent heat flux and sensible heat flux. Latent heat flux is basically the energy that's used to transpire water that doesn't get used to heat the leaf and that doesn't heat the surrounding air. Sensible heat flux basically occurs when the leaf conducts heat to this thin boundary layer around the leaf, and then that heated air convects into the surrounding atmosphere. And then we also have another type of radiation that's emitted by Earth, microwave radiation, that gets partly absorbed by water. And so as that radiation passes through plants, the plants absorb some of that microwave radiation in proportion to the amount of biomass they have and the amount of water that's in that biomass. Ultimately, the things that I'm interested in, and generally the things that we're interested in my part of ecosystem ecology, are the photosynthesis and the latent heat flux. Those are things that are directly related to ecosystem function. In the past, from remote sensing, mostly we've focused on reflectance. There's a lot of sensors in space that measure the reflectance of the surface. Increasingly, though, we're starting to get new sensors and new satellites that are measuring the radiation in some of these other categories. There's some satellites that measure that small percentage of fluorescence that's emitted. There's some types of vegetation indices that we can use to get at the non-photochemical quenching, which is, again, the leaf trying to shed heat. We can measure thermal radiation from space, and increasingly we can measure microwave radiation from space. And so partly what we're doing to try to deal with some of the challenges that we have in dryland ecosystems is to move beyond reflectance-based approaches to integrating some of these other types of remotely sensed measurements into our estimates of evapotranspiration and primary production. We've been installing sensors in parts of the Southwest in particular to try to measure these types of radiation and how they interact with the surface at flux towers. This is that instrument that I showed earlier. The flux tower is over here somewhere. This is a sensor that we put in to measure fluorescence from the surface. We've also installed near-surface sensors that measure hyperspectral reflectance in addition to that fluorescence. And then we've got some sensors installed that measure thermal radiation emission from the surface. And so kind of where we're starting with trying to address that question, how do we improve dryland ecosystem estimates with remote sensing, is to start from the ground up and use these near-surface sensors to figure out what's most important for capturing dryland dynamics. We're actually starting to do some microwave work too. This right here is actually a GPS sensor that gets a microwave signal from the GNSS systems in orbit around Earth. Those GNSS systems work by sending a microwave signal to Earth. And so what we can do is we can put the GPS sensor underneath a plant canopy and see how much of that microwave signal gets absorbed as it passes through the canopy before it gets to that sensor. And that provides us a way to actually see how the canopy changes through time and to measure that with microwave remote sensing. We've got some other ground sensors to see how much plants are growing within those same stands and to see how the microwave signal relates to actual plant growth. I'm not going to talk any more about like this near-surface remote sensing. The basic lessons that we've learned so far is that thermal radiation helps a lot with us detecting water stress. Fluorescence helps a lot with detecting drought stress and seasonality of photosynthesis. And some of the greenness indices do a good job at capturing spatial variation and capturing some of the seasonal variation in photosynthesis and evapotranspiration. What I want to talk about a little bit more about, though, is how we actually scale from the site to the full globe using satellite-based remote sensing. And so partly what our NASA grant was focused on was trying to improve those satellite-based estimates specifically for dryland systems. And based on some of the work that we'd done, we kind of identified a few key components that need to go into this model. The first is we need the surface reflectance. Even though that alone can't tell us about dryland dynamics, it can still give us a lot of information about the spatial variation and about the seasonal variation. To get more of the interannual variation, we also included thermal infrared estimates of land surface temperature, which can tell us a lot about water stress and about how warm it is, obviously. And then we're using microwave-based estimates from SMAP, the soil moisture active passive sensor, to tell us how much soil moisture and what the temperature of the soils were at these sites. The way that we did the scaling was we basically used an ensemble of neural networks with an input layer that consists of all of those different remotely sensed variables that I just talked about, the reflectance, the thermal, and the microwave, plus just some information about the land cover, to predict the gross primary production and the evapotranspiration. And so we've got an ensemble of neural networks that consists of several hundred individual ensemble members. The differences among the ensemble members mostly relate to which observations are left out, which ones are used for training, and the initial conditions of those neural networks. And so what we did is we actually built two different versions of our model, which we call Dryland. One that only includes the MODIS-based satellite data, because we can go back farther in time, back to 2003. One that uses SMAP and MODIS that can't go back quite as far in time, but which has the soil moisture information that we think is important. And that one goes back to 2015. And basically what we did is we actually built two versions of this model. Like I said, the variance structure in primary production is such that most of the variance is in the spatial and the seasonal, and less of the variance is in the interannual. So what we did is we developed models that predicted those things separately, thus forcing the models to fit to the variance that we're interested in. So what we did is for our flux tower data, every single flux tower, we calculated what's the mean seasonality of our GPP and ET, and what are the deviations from that mean seasonality. And we built models that predicted the seasonality and the spatial variation separately from the ones that predicted the interannual, and then summed them back up at the end to give an estimate of what was the actual GPP and ET in any given month. And this is one of the new things about our model that's different from a lot of other models. There's a couple other models that use artificial neural networks just like us, and that use very similar inputs as us. This is the thing that we think is going to help us to specifically get at the interannual variability of these systems. We calibrated and validated our model using 33 eddy covariance towers that are specifically in dryland ecosystems. They're basically entirely in the western US, some in the Iberian Peninsula in Europe, and then quite a few in Australia. The reason that they're in these three places rather than some of the other global drylands is because this is where the networks happen to be public and happen to be easy to obtain. And so that's what we used as our training data. We also used it to validate for those model ensembles, excluding one site entirely from the calibration of one of those ensemble members, and then predicting for that site using models that were trained from all of the other sites. And that's the basis for all of the validation I'll show. So in each case, the model was evaluated on a site that it has not seen. And we just did that repeatedly until we had left out all of the sites. This is an example of some of the model output at one of my favorite flux towers, which is the Santa Rita Mesquite Tower south of Tucson, right down here. And this is basically what our model is producing. So we've basically got a best estimate of gross primary production and evapotranspiration. And then from the model ensemble, we get some estimate of uncertainty or credibility around that prediction. And as you can see, like the model, at least qualitatively, tracks pretty well the variation in both gross primary production. The black is observed, the red is our model prediction, and evapotranspiration. This is a different site from Australia, the Tea Tree East site. And you can see our model did a pretty good job at picking up this really extended drought, this multi-year drought that had occurred, where basically this site was not photosynthesizing at all. And we were able to capture that. That's just a few examples. Across all sites, I'll quickly show some validation results. So here we're showing observed gross primary production versus the modeled. And again, these are all based on cases where each site was left out of the calibration. And basically, we found that we're picking up about 60 to 65% of the variance in gross primary production. That might not sound super impressive, but it's better than a lot of other products. And to some extent, we're kind of sacrificing some of the variance that we're explaining here, specifically because we're trying to get the interannual. This is conflating all three of those types of variance, the spatial, the seasonal, and the interannual. And so to some extent, we're sort of sacrificing our ability to predict the seasonal and the spatial, which hurts that R squared a little bit. This is showing the predictive R squared at each individual site, categorized into forest sites in dark blue, then grasslands, savannas, and shrublands. And generally, at most of the sites, we're getting at least 60% of the variance. You can see there's some of these here where our predictive ability is basically garbage, but I'm not terribly surprised by that necessarily, knowing what I know about those sites. For evapotranspiration, it's a pretty similar story. Again, we're getting 60% of the variance or more at most of the sites, with a few where we're doing slightly worse. And overall, we're getting about 60% of the variance explained across the spatial, the seasonal, and the interannual all conflated together. What we're more interested in is what can our model tell us about interannual variability of carbon and water fluxes. So now I'm going to show first just the ability to capture annual GPP, period. Not the interannual variability, but just annual gross primary production. You can see that we're getting about 70% of the variance in annual gross primary production. Again, this is conflating spatial, seasonal, and interannual variation all in one. That's pretty comparable to what other models have gotten. This is, again, going back to that paper from 2017 that one of my collaborators published. Our ability to capture annual GPP, conflating the spatial, the seasonal, and the interannual, is pretty similar to how the existing models do. What's different is our ability to capture the interannual. So now this scatter plot is showing not observed annual GPP, but GPP anomalies at a given site. So by definition, every site has a mean of 0, and we're measuring the change above or below that. The existing models mostly, like I said earlier, capture about 30% of the interannual variability. In other words, they underestimate the extremes on both sides by about 70%. For us, it's actually closer to 70% of the interannual variability that we're capturing. So it's a big improvement in our ability to detect carbon anomalies. And that is exactly what we were going for. Similar story with evapotranspiration. We don't see a whole lot of difference between our model and the existing models in their ability to capture the spatial and seasonal. With this particular model that's shown over here, we actually do improve on it pretty significantly because this one systematically underestimates evapotranspiration. But where the model really shines is the ability to predict evapotranspiration anomalies. And we significantly improved on our ability to capture that interannual variability and those extremes. So this is another look at the same thing. Now what I'm showing is on the y-axis, the standard deviation ratio, which is just the ratio of the variability from the remotely sensed prediction divided by the standard deviation of our measured quantity. So here, for example, it's the standard deviation of the remotely sensed gross primary production from the satellite divided by the standard deviation of gross primary production from the site. These are each individual sites, and each point is representing one different model. The Dryland models, this is the one that's based only on MODIS. This is the one that's based on MODIS plus SMAP. And then here, this is just summarizing as a box plot all of the individual points shown over here. And so basically, a standard deviation ratio near 1 means that there's the same amount of variance in the satellite product as there is in the actual measurements. So ideally, you want a standard deviation ratio of 1. What we found is that our product underestimates the GPP variability by about 25%. In other words, we have mostly standard deviation ratios averaging about 0.75. The existing products, the other models, underestimate it by more like 50%. So we see a big improvement in our ability to represent variance in gross primary production. Same thing with evapotranspiration. We underestimate ET variability by about 25%. The other models mostly underestimate it by 50% or more, with one exception, which is this light blue one, GLEAM, which is a particularly good ET model. That's the only other model shown here that includes information from the microwave part of the spectrum. And so we're doing a pretty good job capturing the interannual variability. What that ultimately means is that when we sum that up over the entire globe, the carbon fluxes coming from Drylands are much more variable than we previously thought. The time series is just showing the annual gross primary production from Dryland systems summed over the entire globe. Again, the red is showing our Dryland model, and then the other colors are representing some other model. And then over here, we're showing the standard deviation of the gross primary production interannually. And so what we can see is that in the Dryland model, our model, we're predicting much higher variance in gross primary production than other remotely sensed data sets. And so we think that means that Drylands are even more variable than we already thought they were based on the approach that we're using. The next thing that we're working on is figuring out what does this mean for Dryland responses to extreme events like drought, and how much were we underestimating the drought responses of primary production. So these are the next places that we're going with this, figuring out how large are the actual effects of drought on dryland ecosystem processes. And then also a question that I'm particularly interested in, how much has anthropogenic warming specifically amplified the effects of drought on primary production? And so we're using our satellite-based estimates of gross primary production and evapotranspiration to do some simulations to figure out what does the drought response look like when you add anthropogenic warming on top of the precipitation deficits that would just occur naturally. And that's kind of the next step in this process that we're working on. So with that, I'll conclude. Basically, the two main takeaways for this talk are that multi-sensor remote sensing, especially remote sensing that combines the optical, the thermal, and the microwave, can improve estimation of dryland variability. And from that, we've shown that the interannual variability of dryland function is even bigger than we already thought it was. And we already thought it was pretty big. And with that, I'll close the talk and take any questions you have.
Yeah, we have plenty of time for questions, and we want to pass this mic around. If you have a question, just for the benefit of our Zoom folks.
You go back like a slide or two.
Yeah. Tell me when to stop.
This guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this is variability year over year, right?
Yes.
So a lot of these are showing the variability going up as we go through time. Do you have like a hypothesis of why that's happening?
Yeah, so in this case, it's not necessarily, it's a little hard to talk through. So what I'm actually showing here is gross primary production anomalies relative to the mean for each model. The models predict different magnitudes of total gross primary production. What we see in a lot of these cases is not necessarily that the variability is going up, but that there are positive trends in the total amount of dryland gross primary production that's occurring. Drylands are one of these places where climate change to some extent is causing changes in dryland ecosystem structure that result in more carbon uptake. And specifically, there's a couple of things that have likely happened. One is that elevated atmospheric CO2 leads to, generally speaking, either more photosynthesis or more water-efficient photosynthesis and more leaf area. And so that's probably one thing that has happened. We know with pretty high certainty that dryland leaf area has gone up because of that CO2 fertilization effect, and that increase in water use efficiency should benefit dryland plants more than any other type of ecosystem. So that's probably partly it. Some of it could also be due to land use changes that might elevate primary production through time in drylands. I think it's probably largely the former, that we're getting basically greening of dryland systems to some extent. I'm not necessarily saying that's going to be sustained, but some greening of dryland systems that's actually elevating their primary production a little bit.
Great, thanks so much.
Thanks.
We have a question online. Let's see here. The 33 study areas were selected due to easy access to data. If you had an unlimited budget, how many flux towers would you want around the world?
A lot. Partly that's because I think flux towers are, to my mind, one of the coolest technological tools we have in environmental science. I love them. I think they're kind of a miracle of environmental science to some extent. They're just like, the math behind them is so elegant too. Like whoever came up with it, I mean, it's beautiful and beautifully elegant. Lots. I think the main places where I would like to put them, we're gonna go way back here. Whoop, that's a little too far. Here we go. So some of the places that you can see in this map, and especially in this climate diagram, what I'm showing in this climate diagram is not how our towers are distributed through space, but how they're distributed through climate space. So on the x-axis, we have mean annual precipitation. On the y-axis, we have mean annual potential evapotranspiration. You can see that we've actually got like pretty good coverage of the climate space in semi-arid areas. We don't have and in subhumid areas to some extent. We have very little coverage in the drier end of arid areas. And so I think having more arid flux towers would be nice. Having some in undersampled regions would be really nice because like I said, drylands are particularly unique. And so even if we have examples of this climate space from another region, it won't necessarily predict fluxes that well in a specific site that it hasn't seen, even if the climate's similar. The places where we have very few, I mean, you can see there's almost no towers in, at least not towers that we could access in Africa or in South America. And those are generally undersampled regions compared to North America and Europe and Australia. There's a decent network of towers in Asia. They're just very hard to access. It's hard to get the data, which is why they're not included here. So where I would like to put more towers is, again, kind of the more arid side of the arid climate region, and in some of our undersampled areas in the global south. Yeah.
I mean, apart from potentially publishing a paper with a bunch of Dannenbergs at the end, what's next for you in terms of this research? Like, are you planning to just work on improving the model over time, or is there like a next avenue that you're thinking of going down?
That's a really good question. If I'm going to do any more tweaks to the model, the next thing that I would do is to try to include some information on fluorescence, which we don't have in here. There's a good reason that we don't have fluorescence in here. The technology is like a little bit newer than some of the, say, thermal and reflectance-based technology. And the spatial and temporal resolutions of the fluorescence data in particular is kind of challenging. So the fluorescence data doesn't go back very far in time. The stuff that does go back in time is like 50-kilometer resolution, roughly. So it's very, very coarse, and it's monthly resolution. You can't get sub-monthly for the most part. There's some newer fluorescent sensors like Tropomi and OCO3 and some upcoming missions, I think, from the European Space Agency that are going to improve on that spatial and temporal resolution. And so if I were to try to tweak this model at all, it would be to include some of that fluorescence information. I've experimented with a little bit with whether or not we can go from monthly, which is what we're currently doing, down to daily. And the answer was like, not really. Like, I feel like monthly, like when we try to go down to daily resolution, the predictive skill just plummets. And so I think time-wise, we probably can't do too much better than we're doing. Maybe we could go down to like weekly if we really wanted to. I think daily is going to be a stretch. So those are maybe the things that I would try to tweak. However, the grant that funded this is over now. And I kind of feel like I'm ready to move on to other things. So I think for now, at least, I'm probably gonna like set aside tweaking the model and do more like the science applications that I had intended for it, which is like figuring out stuff about like how drought affects these ecosystems and how anthropogenic activity is amplifying those drought effects.
My question is a follow-up to the initial question about some areas that don't have enough representation here.
Yeah.
So are you currently, or do you see yourself working or collaborating with people in some of this area in the future? I'm just curious about that.
That's a great question. If I do decide to like tweak the model more, I think that would be fantastic, especially because like a lot of the towers in Asia, a lot of the long-term towers that are already available, those, like the data access basically requires collaboration, right? And so those would be cases where I absolutely would love to establish local collaborators. I don't have immediate plans to do so because like I said, like I feel like I'm sort of ready to move on to like non-model things for a little while. If I come back to it again though, I think that's where I'd probably look more for those collaborative relationships. And it's actually, this is a great time to be a Dryland researcher because there's hopefully a new NASA program that's focused specifically on arid environments. And so the ability to identify and collaborate with Dryland researchers has gotten much easier, partly because of that program, which has established a lot of that groundwork. So if I do end up going back into the model world, hopefully yes. Other questions?
Yeah, really cool work. So I've not done anything with flux towers or this sort of work before, but I'm getting a sense that these measurements are occurring on the scale of a landscape.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, has there been any work to drill down like species-specific responses in their responses changes?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you're absolutely right. Flux towers integrate over an area, and that area is usually somewhere between 0.01 square kilometers and 1 square kilometer. Somewhere in that range, depending on the height of the tower, the height of the vegetation, and the turbulence of the atmosphere. That'll kind of determine how much area the tower sees, quote unquote. So any species level work would be slightly challenged by that. You would have to have very distinct parts of the landscape that are dominated by different species, I think, in order to do that with flux tower data. We're experimenting with it a little bit at a tower that I run in Iowa, where we actually do have like a very clear dividing line, where on one half of the dividing line, we have like this very monocultural, like brome grassland, and on the other half of the dividing line, we have something that's more approximating a tall grass prairie. We can't get down to the species level necessarily, but we can sample from different parts of that landscape depending on what direction the wind is coming from, and actually distinguish between how like that monocultural brome is doing from how the more diverse tall grass prairie is doing. That, I think, from a flux tower perspective is probably about as much as you can do, unless within the tower footprint you also have pretty good species level instrumentation with other types of monitoring devices. So at some of the flux towers, we have like near surface sensors that are pointed at trees of different species, or we've got instrumentation on different species so that we can distinguish of the signal that we're seeing from the tower, how much of it is coming from, say, ponderosa pine versus Douglas fir or something like that, right? But it requires some ancillary instrumentation.
So just thinking like in the world of photosynthesis and like dryland ecosystems, like differences between like C3 and C4
Yeah.
photosynthesis might be interesting.
I totally agree, 100%. Yeah, and even among C3 plants, you can see like huge differences in how they respond to moisture availability or temperature or something like that too. Yeah, so there are very clearly interesting species level responses that could be disentangled if you had like an ideal instrumentation setup. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Really cool presentation. You talked about how your temporal resolution kind of monthly has been best. In terms of spatial resolution, have you found MODIS to kind of be the best and all that you need? Would you ever consider going to Landsat? Maybe if you were going to do like a flux tower footprint situation and you had different areas that represented different species, is that something you've ever thought about doing?
We have actually. We put in a proposal at one point that was well reviewed but didn't ultimately get funded, to try to do something that was more Western US specific, that was using, I think we had proposed actually even going down to like planet scope level, which is like 1 meter resolution, if I recall correctly, maybe even sub-meter, I'm not 100% sure. So we have toyed with the idea. It didn't get funded, so we never did it. But we've thought about it, yeah. Because I mean, like one of the things that's unique about Drylands too is that they're very patchy landscapes. I mean, there's a lot of spatial heterogeneity in what species are there, what plant structure is like, how much soil there is. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to think that a fine spatial resolution could be potentially beneficial in these types of landscapes. So yes, we've thought about it. We haven't gotten around to doing it yet.
Cool.
All right, we're right at 4. So let's give Matt another round of applause.
Thanks, everyone.
Plenty of refreshments are left. Plenty of time for mingling. Thanks, everybody.